Jochen Rindt. On September 5, 1970, Austrian driver Jochen Rindt arrived at Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, unaware he was about to become the only driver in Formula One history to win the World Championship after death. The 28-year-old was leading the championship by 20 points with just 3 races remaining. He was driving the revolutionary Lotus 72, the fastest car that season with 5 wins already secured, but he constantly complained about the car's handling under heavy braking, a particular concern at Monza. The circuit was known as the Temple of Speed, with cars reaching 180 miles per hour on long straights and barriers placed dangerously close to the track. On Saturday morning at 9:48 a.m., Jochen Rindt accelerated out of Parabolica corner at 195 miles per hour, approaching the brutal braking zone at the end of the long straight. Drivers had to brake from nearly 200 miles per hour down to 80 miles per hour in just seconds. As Rindt applied maximum braking, his front brake shaft snapped completely. The Lotus veered hard right toward the barrier. At that speed, controlling the car was impossible. The car struck the barrier nearly head-on at 140 miles per hour. Mechanics in the pit lane heard the impact from hundreds of yards away. What happened next revealed Rindt's fatal mistake. Like many drivers back then, he refused to wear the crotch straps of his seatbelt properly, finding them uncomfortable. He wore only the lap belt across his waist. When the car hit the wall, Rindt's body slid forward under the lap belt, which struck his throat with devastating force. Track marshals reached him within 90 seconds. Rindt was unconscious with a fractured skull and severe neck injuries. He was pronounced dead at 10:05 a.m., just 17 minutes after the crash. It turned out that his points lead was so large that no one could catch him. 6 weeks later, Jochen Rindt was officially crowned the 1970 world champion, the only driver to ever win the championship after dying. Ayrton Senna. On May 1, 1994, Brazilian driver Ayrton Senna prepared for the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola. The 34-year-old 3-time world champion was considered by many the greatest race car driver who ever lived. The weekend had already seen one violent crash on Friday and Roland Ratzenberger's death Saturday, the first driver killed at a race weekend in 12 years. Senna visited Ratzenberger's body and told his girlfriend that evening he didn't want to race. The race began at 2 p.m., with Senna on pole. He led cleanly for 4 laps. On lap 5, 2 cars crashed heavily, triggering a safety car. For 5 laps, the field drove slowly, allowing tire temperatures to drop dangerously. When racing resumed on lap 7, Senna pushed hard to rebuild heat in his cold tires. At 2:17 p.m., as Senna entered Tamburello corner at 192 miles per hour, something went catastrophically wrong. His car failed to turn. Onboard footage showed Senna desperately sawing at the steering wheel. He was braking hard, but the car wasn't responding. He hit the wall at 135 miles per hour. The right front suspension tore from the car, and a piece of that suspension penetrated the cockpit like a spear, striking Senna in the head and piercing his helmet above his right eye. Professor Sid Watkins, Formula One's chief medical officer and Senna's close friend, reached him within 30 seconds. Senna was unconscious and in critical condition. After stabilizing him, paramedics rushed him by helicopter to Bologna Hospital. Despite emergency surgery, Ayrton Senna was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m., never having regained consciousness. Brazil declared 3 days of national mourning. Hundreds of thousands lined São Paulo's streets for his funeral. The exact cause remains mysterious, likely a broken steering column. Senna's death forced Formula One to transform completely, introducing the HANDS device, improved cockpit protection, and eventually the Halo device. No driver has died in an F1 car during a race weekend in the 30 years since. Today, McLaren's supercar carries his name, the McLaren Senna, honoring the legend. Tom Pryce. On March 5, 1977, Welsh driver Tom Pryce lined up for the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami, one of 23 drivers on track. This would be his final race. The Kyalami circuit where they were racing had almost no safety infrastructure. Track marshals worked dangerously close to the racing line, and when accidents happened, they had to cross the active track where other cars were still racing at full speed. The race started normally, but on lap 22, the car of a racer caught fire on the main straight. 2 young track marshals, including 19-year-old Frederik Janssen van Vuren, grabbed fire extinguishers and made a fatal error. They began running across the track without waiting for a gap in traffic. The straight allowed speeds of around 170 miles per hour, and a blind rise meant drivers couldn't see what was ahead until the last second. Tom Pryce came over the rise at full speed when Van Vuren suddenly appeared directly in his path, carrying a 40-pound fire extinguisher. At 170 miles per hour, Pryce had no time to react. The impact killed Van Vuren instantly. His body was thrown nearly 50 yards, but the heavy fire extinguisher became a deadly projectile, flying into Pryce's cockpit and striking him in the face with such force that it killed him instantly. Here's the truly eerie part. Spectators watched in horror as Pryce's car didn't crash but continued down the straight at full speed for nearly half a mile before finally hitting another car and stopping. Only when marshals reached the wreckage did they discover that Pryce had been killed instantly. Both men were pronounced dead at the scene. Pryce's widow, Nella, later spent years fighting for improved safety. The tragedy led to fundamental changes preventing marshals from ever crossing active racing circuits. Gilles Villeneuve. On May 8, 1982, Canadian Ferrari driver Gilles Villeneuve arrived at Zolder Circuit carrying anger that friends believed affected his judgment on what would become his last day. The 32-year-old from Quebec was one of Formula One's most beloved figures, nicknamed the Aviator for his fearless style. 2 weeks earlier, his teammate had stolen victory from him on the final lap, and Villeneuve arrived at Zolder consumed by anger. With 8 minutes left in Saturday qualifying at Zolder, Villeneuve decided to make one final attempt at pole position, the fastest qualifying time that would earn him the right to start at the front of the race. At 1:52 p.m., he began his flying lap at full speed. The track was crowded with cars, including Jochen Mass's slower car on a cool-down lap. Villeneuve came through a fast corner at 140 miles per hour when Mass's slower car appeared ahead on the racing line. Mass saw Villeneuve approaching in his mirrors and moved right to let him pass on the left. But Villeneuve, unable to see Mass's movement in time, had already decided to pass on the right. Villeneuve's Ferrari struck Mass's rear wheel at 135 miles per hour. The impact launched the Ferrari violently into the air, rotating as it flew over the barriers. Spectators in the grandstands watched the Ferrari tumble through the air for about 100 yards before striking the ground with tremendous force. The car disintegrated on impact. The nose separated, the engine broke free, and Villeneuve was thrown from the cockpit, still strapped to his seat, tumbling another 50 yards. He was immediately airlifted to a hospital but never regained consciousness. Gilles Villeneuve was pronounced dead at 9:12 p.m. His son Jacques was just 11 years old. 15 years later, Jacques would become world champion himself, fulfilling his father's dream. Jules Bianchi. On October 5, 2014, French driver Jules Bianchi lined up for the Japanese Grand Prix in dreadful weather. He would become the first Formula One driver to die from race injuries in 20 years. The 25-year-old from Nice had just scored Marusha's first-ever championship points at Monaco earlier that year. And as a member of the Ferrari Driver Academy, he was widely seen as a future Ferrari star. That weekend, Typhoon Fanfone was approaching Japan, bringing heavy rain throughout race day. Officials considered canceling, but with global television schedules fixed and tens of thousands of fans waiting, they chose to start anyway. Conditions gradually improved, and the race ran normally until late afternoon, when the rain returned, and visibility again deteriorated rapidly. On lap 42, race car driver Adrian Sutil lost control at Dunlop Curve, aquaplaned on standing water, and crashed into the barriers. Race control displayed double yellow flags, signaling drivers to slow significantly, but did not deploy the safety car. Instead, a recovery tractor crane was sent onto the runoff area to lift the damaged car. Racing continued under those caution flags. One lap later, on lap 43, Bianchi approached the same corner at roughly 130 miles per hour. Despite slowing as required, his car hit the same patch of standing water. The car aquaplaned, became uncontrollable, and slid off the track toward the recovery vehicle. Bianchi's car struck the rear of the tractor crane with enormous force. The impact decelerated him violently, and the top of his helmet hit the underside of the machine, causing severe head trauma despite his safety gear. Medical teams arrived within moments and treated him trackside before transporting him to a nearby hospital, where surgeons performed emergency surgery for a severe brain injury. After several weeks, he was moved to a hospital in Nice, France, where he remained in a coma for 9 months. On July 17, 2015, Jules Bianchi died from his injuries. He was 25 years old. His death led to fundamental changes. New rules ensure that no car will ever race past a recovery vehicle again. And in 2018, the Halo cockpit protector became mandatory, saving multiple drivers' lives since. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.